Here we are, week 2 of our series during the month of Sabbath. How many of you would consider yourselves law-abiding citizens? You pretty much follow the law. I'm not going to ask how many of you are outlaws, because I know some of you are like, I'm an outlaw. You know, I got one person back there that's wearing a hat that's got yellow hair all in it, and I don't know what's going on with Marvin this morning. Marvin's sporting his Iowa outfit, and I'm going to tell you, I got something for you special in just a minute. Hang on. But law-abiding citizens, there are those of us, we pride ourselves in the fact that we live within the guardrails of society. We don't look for ways to break the law. But there are some strange laws in this country. And I started looking some of them up. And while they aren't really enforced, these are a list of some. I'd have been here an hour telling you all the ones I found. But here's a list of some of the crazy, ridiculous laws that are on the books today. In Alabama, there we go. In Alabama, it's illegal to play dominoes on Sunday. Okay? In California, here we expect some strange laws in California. In California, there is a law that prohibits a woman from driving a car while wearing a house coat. Here in Florida, failure to tell your neighbor that his house is on fire is illegal. So if his house is on fire and you see it, you better go knock on the door and make sure he knows. Here you go, Marvin. In Iowa, it is illegal for a man with a mustache to kiss a woman in public. And you know, the only reason that these laws are on the books is because enough people were doing it that everybody else had a problem with it, so they had to put a law on the book. I don't know what was happening. This mustachioed madman was kissing women in public, but they passed that law in Iowa. You cannot, if you have a mustache, you cannot kiss a woman in public. In Texas, you are considered legally married if you introduce your partner in public as your husband or wife at least 3 times. That opens up a whole other thing. In Tennessee, it is illegal to drive while you are asleep. I'm so glad that that's on the books, because there was a day that I laid down when I was in college and I was driving back and forth to Tennessee. There were times that I just was like, I'm just going to fall asleep and let my car do the work. No. There were no smart cars back then. But today, I want us to wake up. I want us to be awake as we dive into week 2 of our Sabbath series. Last week, I talked about, the introduction was the rest of God, and how it's important to be intentional and take time to experience God's rest. I gave you 4 R's of Sabbath. The first one was remember. That's how the commandment begins. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And the next one was rest and recreation. During that time of Sabbath, not only do we remember that it is set aside, but we take intentional time to rest or to experience some sort of recreation, something that is life-giving. And the next R was the word reflect, taking time in worship and prayer. The verse says that remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Keep it consecrated, holy, separate, sanctified. It means to be set apart. The Sabbath should look different than every other day. So what we do on that day is we have time for worship and prayer as we reflect during this day that's set apart and consecrated. And then the last thing is what we experience, and that's revitalization. I use the analogy of the soil and how God built the Sabbath years so that for 6 years they plant the crops, and then on the 7th year they don't they just sit back and allow the soil to be revitalized. And then on the 8th year, or when the cycle repeats, it would become the first year. In that moment, that is where the soil then has a year's worth of rest and nutrients, and the crop is even greater. And it's just this cycle that repeats itself. And that's what happens when we take that day of the week to revitalize. We allow ourselves to be replenished with the nutrients that we have. So today I want to change some thinking about Sabbath. The first one I want us to see is it's not that I have to do Sabbath. Thank you. She's going to be making a few trips up here. It's not that I have to do Sabbath. Sabbath is I get to celebrate Sabbath. Now, what has this bag got to do with anything? Hold tight. So there was this pastor who wanted to go play golf, and his schedule was so busy he couldn't find some time to fit it in. So he decided, you know what? Golf is something that I get a lot of life from. I'm not going to go with anybody else, but I'm going to call in, tell them I'm not coming this Sunday. I have a guest speaker, and I'm going to go play golf. And so this pastor goes and he plays golf on Sunday morning. And he stepped up to the first tee box. And God in heaven looks down and sees this pastor on a Sunday morning playing golf while his congregation, his associate pastor, everybody else is having church. And God looks over at St. Peter. Now, we're not going to theologically pick this apart. It's a joke. God looks over at St. Peter and says, I'll teach him to honor the Sabbath. And so the pastor, he starts playing the best round of golf that he's ever played. He's hitting the ball straight. He's not slicing. You know, he steps up. His short game is good. He putts. He's making putts that are 20, 40 feet away. And it's just great. And then on the last hole, the pastor stands up. And it's a long par 4. And he just hits the ball. He cranks it. And it just seems that it gets a tailwind, and that ball soars and soars and soars further than he's ever hit it. And almost as if by the hand of God himself, that ball drops one time in front of the green and then bloop, right into the hole. A hole-in-one on a par 4. He goes nuts. He begins celebrating, jumping up and down. And St. Peter looks over at God and says, why did you do that? How is that going to teach him? And God looks back at St. Peter and says, it's Sunday morning. Who's he going to tell? I mean, if you know any golfer, they're going to tell you about the best shot that they ever hit a bunch of times. And then, well, when did that happen? When I was playing golf on Sunday. Yeah, no. So that was the torture for him, was that he wasn't going to be able to tell anybody about it. But is that how God views the Sabbath? Is that really what he's doing up there? Does God pour out his wrath on us when we disregard the Sabbath? If we miss church on Sunday, does God get mad at us? Do we have to put in extra hours of prayer in order to make up for the Sunday that we missed? Or there, you got some more good works to do. I missed a Sunday last month, and I can't just create a Sunday, so I've got to double up on everything that I'm doing. If you work overtime on a Sunday, does God send curses or plagues into your life? These things may sound silly, but there are those that actually, they truly have that mindset that that's the way God works. So let's go back into the text and see what the text says about Sabbath, and we're going to look at it from a different perspective today. Sabbath, I get to. Not I have to, but I get to. So Exodus 20, beginning in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Boom. He delivers the Ten Commandments. And I told you last week that was the intro into their time in the wilderness, that God gave them that. They were delivered out of the slavery of Egypt, and because of their own failure, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. God had to purge them of that slavery mindset. But before they enter that 40 years, as they're entering the wilderness, God gives them this list of commands, and that is right there in the fourth commandment. And you can see the Ten Commandments there, but then also at the end of the first 5 books, you can see in Deuteronomy chapter 5, they're spoken again. God gave them the commandments when they left Egypt, but almost 40 years later now they're poised to enter into the promised land. That generation was dying off. The younger generation is about to inherit the land that they had been promised, and the Ten Commandments are listed again to reiterate what he had commanded all those years later. Then, immediately following their being listed again in Deuteronomy, God instructs his people, and he says this in Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning in verse 6. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Here's the 10 commandments that I gave you all those years ago, and here's what you're going to do. You're going to teach them. You're going to tell your children every day that they are alive, you're going to instruct them on how the right way for them to live. Sabbath was religious instruction. It was work prohibition. It was a day of remembrance. It was remembering the times that God had delivered them. And through the years, people would disregard that commandment. They would eventually disintegrate as a nation. Talked about how they would divide into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom retained the name Israel. The southern kingdom kept kept Jerusalem and was known as Judah. And this divided kingdom would eventually be overtaken, and they would be led into captivity by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And one of their worst sins leading up to those events was their disregard of the Sabbath. And that failure is mentioned a few times in Scripture. I don't have these for the screen, but it says in Jeremiah 17 that God would warn them not to bear any burden on the Sabbath. It says, if you don't honor the Sabbath, I will kindle a fire, and it shall devour the places of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. So they get taken away into exile. And even in exile, in Exodus chapter 20, while in Babylon, God tells them, I also gave them my Sabbaths as to be a sign between them and me. They greatly defiled my Sabbaths. They despised my judgments. They profaned my Sabbaths. They're in exile. They're away from their homeland. And their captors came in, and they took the best and the brightest, and they enslaved them, and they were trying to kind of assimilate their artistry and their blessing into these other cultures, into the Babylonian culture. And then the Medes and the Persians took over, and all that took place while they were in exile. And in Ezekiel 22, it says, they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths so that I am profaned among them. Eventually, after decades of being in exile, God opened the door for them to return home. You can read about their return home in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, rebuilding the temple and the walls around the city. But they were allowed to go back and rebuild, and when they did, they remembered the messages of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and once restored as a nation, they were determined never to make those same mistakes again. We're not going to do that anymore. So during that time, those in authority wanted to put guardrails up. They wanted to protect, make sure that nobody would violate the Sabbath anymore. And so they began to set these rules and these guardrails in place. Parents understand this. Kids learn a lot of times the hard way not to touch a hot stove. You touch the hot stove, you burn your hand. You can tell them, but they just don't know until they do it. I don't remember the time that I touched the hot stove, but I do remember one time, I don't know what possessed me to do this. I was a little kid, but I took a bobby pin and stuck it into the outlet. And it was this weird buzzing pain. And then I'm like, oh, it was still stuck in there. What am I going to do now? So I think I took my toothbrush or something because it was in the bathroom. I knocked it out. But, I learned, don't do that. But imagine this. A kid burns his hand on a hot stove. To prevent him from doing that again, you put a barrier around the stove. Okay, so now, whenever this kid comes into the kitchen, if the stove is hot, he can't get anywhere near it, and so we're going to be okay. But, like many of you other parents found out, like I found out with my own children, that barrier is not permanent. Because what happens? Kids are smart. They'll come and drag a chair and climb over it. They'll find out how to get through that barrier. And so as parent, we're like, okay, well, that's not going to be enough. So what I want to do is I'm going to put a lock on the door that even goes into the kitchen. And I know kids are pretty good at that. So not only do I have the barrier around the stove and this lock that goes into the kitchen, it's biometric. So only my thumbprint can get me into that. And so, okay, now my kid will definitely not burn his hand on the stove anymore. But you know what? He may sneak in one time before the door closes. So what I want to do is I'm going to confine my kid to his room because I don't want him to even see the stove or even see the kitchen and know that the stove is in there. So I'm going to confine him to his room, and I'm going to give him a Bible and tell him to read that and think about every word in that Bible so that he doesn't go anywhere near the kitchen, so that he wouldn't be tempted to go into the kitchen and be tempted to touch the hot stove. That's ridiculous. But that is a fair comparison to what happened back then. Over a period of years, the religious leaders kept adding more and more guardrails and rules in order to protect them from violating the Sabbath ever again. Not only can we not violate the Sabbath, we can't even think about violating the Sabbath, so we're going to put this other rule in place. And then I don't even want you to get near that, so we're going to put this other rule into place. And it would just double down, and double down. They would do this and go to the extreme in order to reestablish Sabbath to protect Sabbath. Guilt and fear were leading them to go overboard. By the time that Jesus came on the scene, there were 613 rules for establishing the Sabbath. But get this, there were 39 principal actions and categories regarding prohibited actions. So this is what you could not do. You could not sow, you could not plow, you could not reap, you could not gather into sheaves, threshing, cleansing, baking. All of these were just a few of those initial 39 restrictions. But that was just the little guardrail around the stove. It got even deeper. Each of those 39 restrictions had subcategories, which ended up giving hundreds and hundreds of actions that were forbidden on the Sabbath. And so I wanted to give you, I told you earlier, some ridiculous laws that are on the books in our country. I wanted to give you some of these ridiculous laws, these Sabbath laws that were in place. And here's the thing, these Sabbath laws were enforced. Tying certain types of knots was prohibited. You could only tie a knot that could be untied using one hand. Because it's not really work if you only use one hand. You could not spit on the ground because that would disturb the ground, and that was classified as plowing. Ladies, this one was for you. This one's always one of my favorites whenever I study Sabbath and the ridiculous laws. Women were forbidden from looking into a mirror or any reflective surface. Because if they did and they saw a gray hair, they would be tempted to pluck that gray hair. And if they plucked that gray hair, that was work. and they were in violation of the Sabbath. Lock the kid in their room with a Bible so that they don't know. Here's one. You couldn't walk through the grass because if you walked on the grass, you might bend or break a blade of grass, and that was considered threshing. It was in this hypothetical atmosphere, this hypercritical, can't read my own typing, this hypercritical atmosphere that Jesus came and he taught humanity. He said this in Mark chapter 2, beginning of verse 23. One Sabbath, this story of Jesus and his disciples. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you ever read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, and he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them," and this is the foundational thing where Jesus' words echo through eternity. He said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now the Pharisees made it seem like Jesus and his disciples were hard at work, like they were out there with sickles and they were just going at it, but they were just walking through the field. They were plucking heads of grain. In Luke chapter 6, when this story is told, it describes how not only did they pluck the heads of grain, but they rubbed it in their hands in order to rub the grain to get to the chaff away so they could get the actual grain and eat it. They were walking and they were eating. They were not harvesting. They weren't breaking the law of God. In fact, in Deuteronomy 23, it says, "If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain." You see, God made allowances for plucking handfuls of grain from another person's field. They were breaking the man-made legalistic code that had been put as a restriction and a guardrail and a limit to Sabbath. That would be like, okay, well, you got a speeding ticket one time, so as a result, everywhere you drive is going to be like the Tomorrowland Speedway at Disney, where you're driving and there's that rail in the middle, and you go one way, boom, it just, it keeps you on that. No, you can't go any. It goes way, way overboard. Through the years, Sabbath became extremely legalistic, making people feel guilty for their inability to live up to the standard. Now, God's standard is high enough, but what they had done is they took God's standard and put man's standard on top of it. And anytime we put something above God's standard, we are building an idol. We are doing things in the wrong way. Everything we do comes under God, not above him. And Jesus was very plain in verse 27 when he said, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Sabbath is never meant to be burdensome. It was never meant to be something that you just have to do. I just have to endure this. Well, it's my Sabbath day. I want to be doing something else, but I just got to get through this. Sabbath is a get to, not a have to. It's not something that you will be, all these guardrails and things that get put into place. God has given us the gift of his rest that we get to experience because in his sovereignty, in his holiness, and in his perfection, he created the order of the world to work this way because he knew it would be what we would need. And Jesus comes and he sets the Sabbath back on the right track. He returns Sabbath to its original intent, a day of rest from normal work, a benefit, a blessing to those who keep it. Sabbath is a day. It's the first word in that passage, Exodus 28. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Remember. Sabbath sustains you individually. And as a nation, it corporately sustains us. Sabbath restores you, and Sabbath also realigns you. The big one, yeah. Daryl, you can come. Man, these bags are getting heavy. And for the most part, they're empty. Through the years, the Jewish people, they would learn, and they would end up keeping the Sabbath during good times and bad. If you read about, in Jewish history, about the siege that took place at Masada, the fortress of Masada, the story of that, it takes place in between the Old and New Testaments. So you can go and you can find this. It's not mentioned in Scripture specifically, but you can find this in history. That while they were under siege in Masada, this fortress that sits way up, I've been there. It's this seemingly impenetrable fortress on top of a plateau in the deserts of Judea. So during that siege, they kept Sabbath. During famine, they kept Sabbath. During drought, they kept Sabbath. Fast forwarding all the way to the 20th century, in one of the darkest times in the history of humanity, one of the greatest evils took place at the genesis of World War II. During the Holocaust, when Jews were marched into gas chambers and were killed just for their bloodline. I was reading just this week how they would meet in secret and they would form secret prayer groups to honor the Sabbath. There's a picture that I have here. This was just a few of them in one of the concentration camps. Under the watchful eyes of the Nazis, under the watchful eyes of evil that wanted them dead, they still honored Sabbath. Everything was falling to pieces around them. The rabbis have a saying, more than Israel ever kept the Sabbath kept Israel. And during all of that, they honored, they consecrated, they set apart, they sanctified a day and made it holy and dedicated to God. Something else Sabbath does, it realigns us. One of the speakers at General Assembly, who also was a pastor here in the state of Florida, he spoke about realignment. I found this principle to be true many times over this past summer with all the traveling that I've done. And I was reflecting on that recently. Thank you. Hey, y'all give Bella a hand. She was my little assistant this morning. Just traveling, visiting family in different places, traveling, going to see a baseball game here and there, going to the General Assembly in Indianapolis, a quick little 24-hour trip that happened right in the middle of all this glitch that was going on with the computer systems, and Lindsay and I spent most of that time sitting in airports. All of that and travel, you realize that once you travel a whole lot, over time you begin to accumulate more and more baggage. And there are times when we would be packing or unpacking, and don't judge me, I still have a suitcase that hasn't been unpacked from General Assembly. I'm getting to it. Haven't needed anything that's in it. So, when we travel, the more we travel, the more baggage we end up accumulating. And we get to the point where these things get heavy. And we were never meant to carry this kind of baggage. But the more that we carry it, the more out of alignment we become. Because we were not meant to carry this kind of weight. We were not meant to carry this kind of baggage. And what happens is there's, at the airports, I saw this, I've been months ago since the first time I saw it. But at airports, they have these chiropractors. And they will actually give you a chiropractic adjustment while you wait between flights. I'm like, that's genius. Because you carry these bags for so long, you need an adjustment. Well, guess what? Sabbath is our opportunity for realignment. And God gave us, it's not a have to, it's a get to. Our bodies were not designed for us to continually carry this kind of baggage. And so what we do is God made a way so that on one day a week, however we choose to honor it and celebrate it, we come and we take off our baggage. Once a week, we lay it down. Once a week, we say, man, I've been carrying this for far too long, and I need to set it down at the feet of Jesus. Lord, you've given me this burden. This right here was the one I started with, and this is my calling. And I'm not going to turn loose of my calling. But you know what? He wants to take it and make it easy. He wants you to make sure that we give that to him, because if it is truly our calling, when we get it back the day after Sabbath, it'll feel a whole lot lighter than it did when we laid it down. And whatever it is, we lay it down. We put our baggage at the feet of Jesus. And so that's where I want us to be for the remainder of our time today. We did some prayer just a few moments ago, but I want this altar to be open, and I'm letting you know right now, this is the opportunity to come for prayer of restoration, for prayer of realignment. Everybody, will you stand? If you need a spiritual adjustment this morning, if you need a renewal and a restoration in your life, in whatever it is that's going on with you, because you have carried it around for so long, now is the time for restoration and realignment, for God's Spirit to fill you to the overflow. And that's one of the beauties of having His presence and His Spirit within us. It's not just the tinglies that we get at church. It's not just the talking in a funny language that nobody else understands but God. All of those things are part of a Pentecostal experience. But we have been given the authority of the presence of God that we can resist even picking up more baggage to begin with. That when we face the world, that His Spirit dwells within us, and so much so that we understand the importance of the rest of God. And we lay those burdens down, and in return, we receive His peace and His presence by His Spirit that dwells within us. So maybe that's what you need today. You just need His Spirit to fill you so that you are empowered to be witnesses, so that you are empowered to lay those burdens down, so that you can realize, like I said last week, that the world will still turn if you're not the one controlling it, because guess what? You're not the one controlling it. And when we get to that moment and we see the spiritual significance in rest, then we receive what He's trying to give us. Not falling into the legalistic trap of 613 rules that we're going to lock somebody in the bedroom with a Bible because we don't want them to burn their hand on a stove. But we're going to say, I'm going to take the guardrails off. I'm going to live by the Word of God. And God has built this in. My flesh is renewed. My spirit is renewed. My life is realigned with God at the head, and everything else falls into place. As I begin to pray, if you need prayer this morning, you may come. Father, thank you for the realignment that you give us. Lord, you created us to need certain things in our lives. We need food. We need water. We need shelter. We need rest. And Lord, all of those things that you provide for us, you make a way. For built in that we follow that cycle, we can live lives blessed. We can live lives in your presence exactly the way that you have designed us to be. But Lord, sometimes we take it into our own hands. Sometimes we bless ourselves a little too much. Sometimes we do things that get us out of alignment. Sometimes we enjoy the things of life and neglect what we should and shouldn't do. But Lord, this is our opportunity as we're crying out to you today. Father, restore us, realign us, get us in line with what you're doing and with who you are, your character. Lord, I don't want to be outside your character. I don't want to be outside your will. I don't want to be in a place where I have to course correct in order to get back. Lord, I want the guardrails that you've placed in place to be there. But Lord, not so many additional man-made restrictions that I miss the point altogether. So God, we honor you on this day of Sabbath. I pray for every